Failure and setbacks are a part of life. Especially in the music industry, we have to deal with reaction and criticism a lot. Whether you are a producer or a musician navigating the music industry, in this video I will go over the psychology of why we react negatively to criticism, setbacks and failures, and what to do about it. I will also teach you how to treat people to make them feel more comfortable with you. Developing your people skills is one of the most important things to help your career in the music industry. My name is Mo and I produce metal. Apart from music, I've gone through some psychology training and education, and I would like to share some of this knowledge with you today. What I will base this video on is the so-called SCARF model and how it can be applied to different situations in the music industry. The SCARF model was created by David Rock in 2008 and consists of 5 letters, each representing an area in which our brain reacts to positive and negative situations. It is grounded in our survival tens of thousands of years ago when we were living on the savannah and exclusion from the group was life-threatening. All humans relate to these 5 areas, but in different amounts based on upbringing and life experiences. All areas of SCARF can trigger both threat response and our reward response in the brain. An interesting point though is that the threat response is in general 5 times as strong as the reward response in the brain, because acting on threats has historically been more important for our survival. I'm now going to go through all 5 letters of the SCARF model and give examples of situations that can trigger each area. S stands for status. It relates to our relative importance to others. It can be in comparison to your band members, to your family, or to society at large. The evolutionary reason for this is that if our status in the group was threatened, it could be life-threatening for us. The threat response in this area tends to go off when our competency is criticized, if we are worse than someone else at something, or if we are publicly shamed. If you have, for instance, been bullied growing up, then your response to status-related criticism can be stronger than the average person. An example of a situation for an artist where the status threat response can kick in is when you upload a song and no one listens to it. On streaming services, it's very obvious how many listeners a band has, and it's clear what their status is based on that. A band that has 100,000 listeners per month has a higher status than one that has 1,000 listeners per month. It's only natural that we compare ourselves to these bigger bands and then our status threat response kicks in. An example for a producer is when you don't get picked for a mixing job. Your brain will interpret this like your status is not high enough to get the job, and then the threat response kicks in. The reward section of the status area kicks in when we get positive feedback and get public recognition. A concrete way to increase this is to start acting on it yourself to people around you. If you give people positive feedback, it will make them feel comfortable with you and sets the standard so they start giving it to you as well. Before we move on to the next letter of the model, why is this important? Well, because if we understand why we react in certain ways, it's number 1, much easier to not take it personally, and number 2, we can start to find ways in which we can increase the reward side of each of these areas. If we have lots of reward reactions, it makes us more resilient to the threat response in each area. We can also understand other people's reactions better and express ourselves in a more strategic manner. You can actively use behaviors that set off reward responses to make people around you feel more comfortable with you. Moving on to the C, which stands for certainty. It relates to our ability to predict the future. And the evolutionary reason for this is that if we can't predict the future, we don't know what threats lie in it, and we then perceive uncertainty as dangerous in itself. If you've had unpredictable parents or friends growing up, then this side of your brain will be more susceptible to negative responses. Threat response goes off by unpredictable behaviors, lies, or a lack of transparency. An example of this is when you don't get a response from someone. Say you have a deadline and the band is not answering your messages. This fires off the certainty threat response. Also, if people act very cheerful with you one day and then are very cold the next, it also creates a threat response in the certainty area. That being said, both of these examples can also fire off the status area, because if someone doesn't answer you, your brain might interpret that your status is low. Some situations may trigger all 5 of the scarf areas. The reward response for certainty happens when we get clear expectations and goals, clear deadlines, and transparent communication. You can get more of this by being clear and transparent yourself to model the behavior to bands, for instance. It can also be good to set clear expectations and social rules for your collaboration. For instance, what time you expect answers by, and also standing up for these expectations if they are broken. Do you have examples of situations where your threat response is kicked in, and how did you deal with it? Comment below. The A stands for autonomy, and it relates to our sense of control over events and our sense of independence. Evolutionary reason for this is that if we lose control of our own actions, that could be very dangerous. Say if someone else in the tribe makes decisions for us. An example of someone who has a very high threat response in this area is a highly individualistic solo artist who has an extremely high need for autonomy, which makes them not work in a band context, ironically at the expense of the bandmates' autonomy. The threat response goes off when we get micromanaged and when we don't have options. This can be especially sensitive to musicians and producers who are generally creative people. Creativity needs freedom to work properly, and if the options are limited, there is no freedom. An example of this is if you work with a producer or band who are micromanaging how you get a certain result. Use this compressor, or add exactly 2.5 dB at 2300 Hz on the guitar, are statements that can make this threat response go off. Or maybe it's a producer who doesn't listen to the band's input on song structures. The reward response fires when you get to become involved and get to choose between different options. The producer gets more free reins to get a certain vision. The artist gets to have influence on the production. A good way to get more of this is to model it yourself by being inclusive and asking for input, and also to ask to give your input if you are feeling that you're not getting enough influence on a project. Moving on to the R, which stands for relatedness. It relates to how safe we feel and how close connections to other people that we have. The evolutionary reason for this is that if we are not close to the people around us, how do we know that they're not going to hurt us in the long run? People who have been betrayed in the past are more sensitive in this area. The threat response in relatedness goes off when we meet people we don't know, when we are feeling excluded, or we don't get help from others. It can also be set off when we are competing with people. An example of this can be if certain band members have a meeting without you. Maybe we ask for help with something and no one wants to give it to us. The reward reaction goes off when we spend time with friends, when we coach and mentor each other, and when we have personal contact with people. A good practice can be to video call or meeting face to face instead of emailing. You can feel much more certain about how a person feels about you if you can see their face and listen to their tone of voice when you're talking to each other, rather than just over a text message. This creates security and gives you reward responses in relatedness. You can also start offering and asking for help from the people that you work with. Creating a culture of helpfulness is not only important for the happiness of the group members, but also for the overall efficiency of a project. F stands for fairness. This relates to how fair we perceive exchanges between people are. The evolutionary reason is similar to the status one, but more group-based. If the group doesn't treat each member fairly, how can I know that I'm not the next one to be thrown under the bus? The threat response kicks in when our expectations are not met, and when someone is treated differently than someone else for no clear or good reason. It's heavily connected to our sense of right and wrong. Maybe you don't get the same chance as someone else in a mixing contest, or you are put off off the live show at the last minute for no apparent reason as a band. The reward response comes when we receive clear motivations and communication about changes, when the group members can chime in on decisions, and when it's a sense of equality in the group. A good practice can be to check if all members of the group are okay with decisions before making them. In conclusion, the music industry has a lot of triggers built in for different areas of the SCARF model. The good news is that there are things that you can do to appease your brain and get more reward responses going. I hope you found something in this video useful. Until next time, take care.